Okay, so it's just after 12, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I think attendees will be joining us into the webinar session as we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Julie Fortin, and I'm really excited for our webinar today about how to have important conversations about your health. Before we get started, I wanted to make everyone aware, for those who were not able to see the download in the emails that came out, in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, there's a link to download a workbook, a complimentary workbook to accompany this webinar today. So if you don't already have a copy of that, feel free to click on the link in the chat box to download that workbook to follow along as we go. We'll leave that there throughout the session. If you have questions throughout the session, feel free to put those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And that way, our hosts are able to see your questions as well as any responses you may have to any questions that are asked. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Ashwini Bapat, and she is an aging and illness coach with Ashwini MD, and a board-certified palliative care doctor. She helps people who are aging, living with illness, and their caregivers make medical decisions that align with their values. Dr. Bapat completed her internal medicine residency and fellowship in palliative and hospice care at Yale University, previously worked at Massachusetts General Hospital, and was an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Bapat, welcome, and thank you for being here today to share your knowledge with us about how to start an important conversation about your health.
Julie, thank you so much for inviting me, first of all, and thank you to all of you for joining me for lunch, essentially. Today, I'm going to give you a framework on how to have an important conversation about your health. And when I talk about this, I'm really talking about figuring out what's most important to you so that you can get the medical care that you want. This webinar is interactive, so I want you to get ready to type in that Q&A section because I'm going to be asking you a couple questions as we go through the webinar. So as Julie mentioned, I'm a palliative care doc, and I'm also an aging and illness coach with Ashwini MD. And at Ashwini, we are a team of 2 physicians, 1 social worker, and 1 chaplain. And as coaches, we work very, very closely with caregivers, with people living with illness, and people who are aging to help them get better medical care for themselves, to really help them adapt to their illness and caregiving journey, and to help them build a support network around them. So let's just get to it. So I'm going to start with a client that I recently took care of. Her name has been changed, and this is not her picture. So Margot was recently diagnosed with early stage dementia. And she reached out because she and her husband were really struggling. So around the time that Margot and her husband were getting ready to retire, they had done everything. They did their due diligence. They had a healthcare proxy in place. They had a backup healthcare proxy in place. They had their living will. They had their estate planning. And so when she got this diagnosis, which was about a year prior to when I saw her, she thought that she and her husband would kind of plan for the future together now that the future looks like it's going to include dementia. But she shared that, he doesn't really want to talk about dementia or the future. I'm worried he's just ignoring what they said. And so I guess I want to hear from you guys, does this feel familiar to you? Have you ever tried to have a conversation with your spouse, with your partner, about what matters most to them with their health? And has that conversation then just kind of gone nowhere? Or maybe you are a healthcare proxy for your mom, and every time you try to bring it up, she's always like, you know what, we're having dinner. This is just not a good time, or stop being a Debbie Downer. Does this feel familiar to you at all? Let me know in the Q&A. I hope folks are able to respond in the Q&A section. Let's see. So for a lot of folks, when they think about having this let's see, did something pop up? Okay, I see. So someone commented, and I'll just read it out so that everyone on the webinar can hear. My mother doesn't like to discuss her health with me. She will occasionally mention issues she's having, but won't go into detail and refuses to answer questions. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think this is something I hear all the time about people just not wanting to talk about it and not wanting to really answer any questions. So I think this happens all the time, and it can be frustrating for the spouse. It can be frustrating for the kids. And that's actually exactly why today I really want to give you kind of 3 steps to start this conversation much earlier on. So most people actually think that this conversation is most important kind of much later on in their life. But this conversation is actually really important to have early on in your life. And it's best had when you are sitting at home comfortably, maybe curled up on the couch, listening to a webinar, as opposed to sitting in a paper-thin patient gown in a cold hospital, feeling exhausted because you just boarded in the ED the entire night and you got 0 sleep. So this is why I think it's really important to have these conversations much earlier on. So here are the 3 steps to starting an important conversation about your health. The first step is to confront your fears. I think that's what keeps a lot of people from having this conversation. And I think that's what makes people avoid this conversation. The second step is to find clarity. And then the third step, noticeably the last step, is actually to start that conversation. And so you can see that even before you start that conversation, there's actually a lot of prep work that needs to be done. So the first step to starting a conversation about your health is really to confront your fears. And look, let's be real, it is uncomfortable to talk about your future health, let alone to try to plan for it. So I really want to ask all of you to start unpacking some of those fears that get in your way. And I'm going to walk you through that through a couple of questions, about 3 or 4 questions in the next couple of slides, and you can respond in that Q&A section. So let's just start with naming it. What makes it difficult or uncomfortable to talk about your future health? Let me know in that Q&A section. And, feel free to chime in, really, like anything, whatever comes to the top of your mind is what I'd love to hear. And I have a feeling that whatever may have made it uncomfortable for you is also what makes it uncomfortable for like hundreds, thousands of other people. So just, okay, thank you. So someone said, all of the unknowns make it really uncomfortable. Absolutely. I think when you think about the future, particularly when it comes to your health, you're right. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot that you don't know that could happen, right? Anything else that comes, so the unknown, the uncertainty, makes it uncomfortable to talk about your future health. Anything else that pops up? The thought of aging and having these unexpected and unwelcome changes is scary. Absolutely. Unexpected, unwelcome changes is absolutely scary. And that can absolutely get in the way of having this conversation. What else pops up for you guys? When I try to bring this up, children do not want to discuss it. Yes. So they also feel uncomfortable, right? And they don't want to hear it. They don't want to talk about it. And you're trying to talk about it, and it's uncomfortable for both of you. Absolutely. I find it difficult because I don't feel like I have control over the unknowns of what will happen with my health in the future. So I don't know what to prepare for. Yes, 100%. It's true. I don't think anyone can predict what will happen to you in the future in terms of your health. And so it feels like it's kind of this black hole. And then how do you prepare for it? Awesome. So I'll go to the next question. And I guess the next question I have for you is, what do you worry about in actually having this conversation? And I think some of you have kind of addressed it in the prior question. I think there's worry about uncertainty for sure. But any other worries that pop up? I think some of you voiced in the earlier question in your responses that I think it sounded like some of you worry about getting shut out, or that the conversation wouldn't be well received. And then, one of the things you worry about, one of the responses is not knowing how to get started, or what to discuss and actually prepare for. So that is awesome. And we're actually going to get into that today. So that's a great question. And then someone else in the chat actually said the unknowns. I don't want to upset anyone. That's a very real concern, that by bringing up this conversation, you're going to upset someone. That's very, very common. A common worry. And then I guess the flip side of this is, how do you think you would benefit from thinking about your future health and what's important to you? What are some of the advantages to that, or how could things get better for you if you were able to have this conversation? It's less, okay. I think I read that one. Okay, so someone responded, peace of mind and getting everyone on the same page together. Absolutely. I think peace of mind is huge. Getting people on the same page together is also a huge benefit. Being on the same page. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. And I guess for you, what's the ideal scenario in having this conversation? Where would you have this conversation if you were to have it? Who would you be having it with? And how would it ideally kind of go? Let me know in the Q&A. Someone said, I'm interested in having this conversation with my aging parents. It will help me to be clear about their desires. Absolutely. So gaining some clarity about what your parents want would be great. And it sounds like you would want to have this conversation with your parents. And that's very understandable. Okay. So I think the bottom line of this first part of confronting your fears, and once again, when you have the workbook, you can dive into it a little bit more deeper on your own time in privacy, is that sometimes, actually, I would say a lot of times, acknowledging what's actually getting in your way can help you start a conversation. So the second step to having an important conversation about your health is actually to find clarity for yourself. So what do I mean by this? I mean, you have to take a step back and get clear on what you want and get clear on what you want to communicate in this conversation. And why is that important? And it's important for a very simple reason. It's that when you know what you want, any decisions regarding medical care or how you want to be cared for or where you want to be cared for, it becomes clearer. I wouldn't say these decisions are easy, but at least it adds a little bit more information so that people can make informed decisions. And I think of this often for a caregiver or a healthcare proxy. I mean, this came up in the chat. You know, if you were to have this conversation and if you were to get clear on what was important to you, or I guess what was important to your mom in this case, you can actually advocate for them. You can better advocate for them. You can actually better respect their wishes if you actually knew what they wanted. And so to take part in this conversation, I think you first have to get clear on what's actually important to you. So Margot, similarly, you know, she wanted to talk about things with her husband, but to be honest, she wasn't sure what exactly she needed to talk about. She wasn't sure what her dementia journey would look like. And she honestly didn't know what she didn't know, right? And so we worked with her to find clarity of what is important to her. So we really helped her define her hopes, her goals, and her values at this stage of her life, at this season of her life. And someone in the chat box said, you know, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the future holds for my health. So how can I kind of plan for so much uncertainty? And I think my response to that is when you figure out, when you know what's important to you, it doesn't really matter what type of health situation pops up, whether it's a question about needing this surgery or starting this treatment. When it's clear what's most important to you, regardless of what situation arises when it comes to your health, you can filter the options through, is this treatment going to get me closer to my goals? Is it going to get me closer to what's important to me? Am I going to get more of those days that feel meaningful to me? And so to help you clarify what is important to you, I'm going to walk you through a series of questions to really help you get clear on what's important. And then I'll then explain how this information can be used by your medical team. So I always start with this question because I think it's really important. And for this, I think, because it's probably personal, you can just kind of jot it down on a piece of paper. But what does a good day look like to you now? What brings you joy right now? Feel free to, if you feel comfortable, feel free to put that in the Q&A box, or if you just want to jot it down, that's totally okay. And for example, some people may say that right now, picking up my grandkids from daycare and bringing them home and having snacks with them is like the best thing. Someone else may say, going for a walk with my dog in the fall is awesome, right? So what does a good day look like to you now? And if you feel comfortable sharing, obviously put it in that chat box. And the reason why I asked this question and why this question is, I think, like easily one of the most important questions I ask is because when there are health issues that come up, whether it's a new diagnosis like dementia, like in the case of Margot, it was a new diagnosis of dementia. Our goal in terms of the type of care that she receives is really to make it so that she has more of those good days. And for Margot, what those good days looked like, what that good day looked like, it did change over time. And that's okay. But as long as we kind of knew what that goal was that we were trying to get her to, it made decisions regarding how she wanted to be cared for and where as her dementia progressed much clearer, because we wanted to make sure that anything we chose got her more of those good days that felt meaningful to her. So that's why this question is incredibly important. So the second question is, how much information do you want to know about your health? Feel free to jot down your answers here. And if you feel comfortable, you can also share it in the chat box. It's really up to you. Let me go back to that. So the reason I ask this is because there are some people who want to know every detail about their health. There are other people who would prefer that they just know kind of the basics. They don't need all the details. And other people that prefer that information is filtered through their family. And once you know how you want your information, you can once again bring this back to your medical team, to maybe it's your primary care doctor, and be like, hey, I love knowing every single thing about my scans and my labs, and I would love to just kind of receive that directly. Or maybe you're like, you know what, I don't need all the details of my labs and scans. Maybe if you could just give me the summary. That way your medical team can provide the type of information you need. And this becomes even more important if you were to live with kind of an illness or a progressive illness like dementia. That becomes very important. The next question is, how do you make decisions about your health, and who would you want involved in that process? So this is important to think about, because when there are hard decisions that need to be made, you want to make sure that you kind of know who to turn to. So for some folks, they're going to say, I'm going to talk this over with my wife, and then I definitely want my kids to know. And so that informs in step 3 who you're actually going to talk to when you go to have this conversation. If you want your wife and your kids to be involved in this conversation, then if they're going to be involved in helping you make decisions, then you want them to be part of that conversation in step 3. And so that's why this is important. And the other thing I'll say about this is, let's say you only talk, you're like, you know what, it's just me and my wife. I don't really, no one else is really involved in making decisions for my health. Then I also ask you, you know, who does your wife talk to when she needs to make a decision, a hard decision? Does she then talk it over with your kids? Because if there's a situation where you're unable to communicate with for yourself, then your wife is going to turn and talk to your kids, right? And so then it's important to include your kids in that conversation that we'll talk about in step 3. And other questions, you know, you may want to consider is, one of the questions is, you know, how do you feel about living in a nursing home? And I ask this question because I work with so many caregivers, and a lot of them feel grief, they feel regret, they feel guilt, that they were in a situation where they had no better option than to put their mom or their dad in a nursing home. And to be honest, for a lot of people, a nursing home is not so much a choice. For a lot of people, it's a decision that's made by the circumstances of the illness. And so I would say that if you feel strongly that you don't want to be in a nursing home, then having this conversation allows you to plan for, let's say, 24/7 caregiving coverage, to plan for that financially, or to make sure that you have resources where you can provide that. And if you're one of the people where you're like, well, if push came to shove, maybe a nursing home would be okay, but I want to be in a good one, then maybe you'll do your research and maybe you'll take a look at what are the nursing homes that are around me. Let me go visit and let me tell my family like which ones, the type that I like. That way, if this question does come up, they can make a better informed decision about the type of nursing home, and then you can also plan for it financially. Another question to think about is, you know, if your health got worse as you got older, how would you want to spend your time? Who do you want to be with? What do you want to be doing? Where do you want to be? I think that's really important to think about. And then importantly, you know, do you have a trusted provider with whom you can have this conversation? So for some folks, they have a PCP or primary care clinician that they feel really comfortable with, in which case you can bring kind of these questions and your answers and the workbook to them and start a conversation with them. And what I love about these questions, which actually goes to the point of one of the participants who commented in the Q&A, is that to answer these questions, you don't really need to know what type of health situation you're going to have in the future. You could answer these questions with how you're feeling right now. What does a good day look like to you now? How do you want to receive your information now? How do you feel about a nursing home now? And that way you have some sort of foundation so that if something happens, your wishes in response to certain questions are a little bit more clear. And, you know, I think I also want to highlight that these conversations, these questions, they're often not a one and done. And you'll probably go back and revisit these conversations and these questions as your health changes, as the aging process changes for you. Regarding living in a nursing home, how do you get a real picture of what it will be like? So someone in the Q&A asked, you know, how do you get a picture of what it will be like? I think, I don't know if you can capture the experience of what it will be like completely, but I would say, you know, instead of the nursing home being kind of like a black hole of, I'm not sure what that looks like, I would say go visit some nursing homes. Visit the ones, do a little bit of research of the ones that are near you, do a tour with them, hang out with them for a couple days, see what types of activities and programming they have, the different types of care units they have. I think that'll give you a better sense of what it may look like to live in a nursing home. Yeah, I think that's my response to that. And I would love for you guys to actually answer this in the Q&A. I'm curious what it feels like to actually be asked these questions. Has anyone asked you these questions before? Let me know in the Q&A. So for some folks, they haven't really been asked these questions. And a lot of the folks that I've talked to, they kind of feel relieved that there's even a space for them to answer these questions. Okay, so someone said, these aren't questions I've been asked before. It's interesting to consider, and I feel that this will be something rolling around in my brain. Yes, for some time to come. Yes. And I love that response because I think that really goes back to how these questions are evergreen. And it goes back to someone said, you know, how can I plan for an uncertain health future, right? And it's true, like, you don't know what your health is going to look like, but these are questions that you can go back to over time. And for a lot of people, the answers to these questions change over time. But I think this gives you a good framework of what you can bring to the table when health issues come up or when things get complicated when it comes to your health. These questions, someone said, these questions are new to me, but are good to provide a framework to help planning. Yes, I really want you to know that these are questions exactly that you're going to noodle on over time. You don't have to think about this every single day. I don't think you need to. I think going through it once and maybe revisiting it once a year and checking in on your answers and being like, yep, they're still valid. Or going through these questions, if something happens with your health, I think that's a really great time to relook at these questions. Okay, so step 3 of this process is actually to start the conversation. But there is a way to optimize the conversation. And I want to be clear, look, this doesn't mean the conversation won't be uncomfortable. I think we're just not used to having these conversations. So if we start from a place of, yes, it's probably going to feel uncomfortable, and there is so much we can benefit from it, I think that's how I would frame this conversation. So this is my suggestion of how to kind of set up the conversation for it to go as well as possible. So I would first say, you know, pick your person. Who is the person that you want to talk to? Maybe it is your wife, maybe it's your kids. And I would say, give them a heads up. Let them know you want to talk about your health wishes. Because this can be kind of a heavy topic of conversation. And you just want them to know what they're getting into before you kind of spring it on them, right? And I would say decide on a time and place, pencil it in and put it on your calendar, because unless it's on your calendar, it is not real. So, and I also think it doesn't have to be done in some like sterile environment. You know, you can meet up with this person with your kids in a coffee shop, go for coffee. You can go for a walk with whoever it is you want to talk with. Maybe you decide to play a tennis match and then talk afterwards as you're cooling down. But you can make it a little bit more relaxed and a little bit looser to really help you kind of talk about some of these things. So in the next 3 slides, I'm going to give you a couple conversation starters. So these are kind of ways that you can open up the conversation. So one example would be, even though I'm healthy now, I've been thinking about what would be important to me if I were to get sick. Can we talk about plans together today? Another option is, I know I'm living with lupus. I want to make sure we talk about what would happen if my illness got worse. Can we talk about it together now? Or, you know what? I was thinking about what happened to Uncle Tom, and I want to make sure we talk about if something like that happens to us. Is it okay if we talk about this? And you'll notice that in all 3 of these conversation starters, at the end, I always asked for permission. I always said, is it okay if we talk about this? Because I want to make sure, even though I gave that person a heads up, I want to make sure that they're going to be able to hear me now, that they're ready for this conversation now. And if they weren't, I would kind of walk them through step 1. Some of the questions I asked you, I would walk them through some of that and be like, hey, it's uncomfortable, huh? Like, what do you think? What do you think is getting in the way for you in talking about this? So I would go back and ask them some of the questions that I asked you and see if you can work it out that way. And then this is an example, just one example of how you can actually share your wishes. I think you can start with something like, you know me really well, you may know how I feel, but it's really important for me to say all of this out loud. I want you to know the things that make me happy. I need you to know if time were short, this is how I'd want to spend it. And then you can kind of go into the conversation a little bit more. So what happened to Margot? So we guided Margot through these questions, tailoring it more so to dementia and the types of decision points that come up with dementia. And she did start this conversation on her own with her husband, but things got pretty tough. They kind of hit a roadblock. He didn't want to talk about it. But we were able to all meet together, the 3 of us, and work through some of the fears that he had about this conversation. And once she was clear on her wishes as it related to dementia, we and her husband was on board because as dementia progressed, it was going to be the husband who was going to be making decisions on her behalf. We then got her medical team in on the conversation. So we just called up the primary care doctor. We shared with him what Margot had communicated with us. And we made sure that he was aware that if there are any medical decisions that come up, that we integrate her values into that decision-making process. And like I said, even for Margot, it wasn't a one and done conversation, but she didn't have to revisit it for a while. And we only kind of revisited it after she had 1 or 2 hospitalizations due to some of the complications from dementia. And at that time, we revisited the conversation actually with her husband because the dementia had progressed by that point. But after our early sessions, Margot, instead of feeling overwhelmed and lost, she shared, I now feel like one thing has been taken off my shoulders, because she felt comfortable knowing that her husband had some idea of what was important to her. So I think my bottom line for, step 3 is that the conversation is uncomfortable. There are definitely advantages to it. You can definitely get peace of mind. You can get better medical care by actually working through this discomfort. I think that as a clinician is so clear when people come and when a patient comes and they know what's important to them, or their family can share with you what's important to them, the clinical decisions are just so much easier. It doesn't make them less sad. It doesn't make it less stressful, but it just makes it so that we're all working towards that same goal. And I will say, the honest truth is that sometimes it's so much easier to talk to a third party. Sometimes it's hard to have this conversation with your mom. Sometimes it's hard to have the conversation. Sorry, I'm fighting off a cold. But sometimes it's hard to have this conversation with your kids. And I will kind of just share a personal story I had of my dad was recently diagnosed about a year and a half ago with early stage dementia. And my brother and I knew that there's a window of time when someone with dementia can still express their wishes. And we knew it was super important for us to have these conversations with my dad. And so I was the designated person to do that. And I sat down with him and he was just like, no, I can't talk with you. I can't actually share with you what I'm going to say because you're not going to like it. And I think there was some wisdom in that for sure. But my parents were open to talking to one of my colleagues, one of our coaches, Caitlin, and they set up an appointment. And in that 1 hour that they spent with her, by the end, Caitlin sent a document outlining his wishes, where they talked about what's important to him, where they talked about nursing homes, where they talked about hired help and how he'd want to be taken care of. And when I read that document, I was like, thank God, because I couldn't have that conversation with my dad. It was just too much. It was a daughter-father relationship, and it was complicated. But my colleague could. And when I read that document, I was like, okay, we're good. We have the information we need so that when we need to make decisions, my brother and I and my mom can work together to come back to this document and really advocate for my dad and feel at peace with some of the decisions that we may need to make. And I'm so glad that we had that conversation then, because, you know, his dementia has progressed, and these conversations are not the simplest conversations, and I'm not sure we would have been able to have them now. But I will say that even for folks who haven't had this conversation yet with your parents or with your kids, I think it's always important, like, use this framework and really try it out and set up some time to work through these questions, to go through it on your own, because as a parent, the clarity you provide to your kids will be huge. And as an adult child, if you are responsible to care for your parents, I think that clarity and peace of mind is everything. So with that, I outlined 3 steps to starting an important conversation about your health. Step 1 is to confront your fears. Step 2 is to find clarity. And step 3 is to actually start the conversation, understanding that it may not be a one and done, and you're probably going to want to revisit these questions at a later date. And a lot of people ask me, okay, awesome. I have answered your questions. I think I know what's important to me now, and I'll revisit it in the future if things change. But how do you use that information to get me better medical care? And I would say that is not on the role of the patient. I think that's on the role of the medical team. And oftentimes they consult palliative care because we're really good at integrating the individual's values, or sometimes their family values. And we integrate that with our knowledge of the types of treatments that are available. And we use those values, what's important to you, to really filter through those options and make sure that we present options that are more likely to get you closer to your goals, or more likely to give you more of those good days that you want. So that's how we use that information. And that's why answering those questions are really quite important. And with that, if you haven't already, make sure to grab the complimentary workbook. You can dive deeper into it and you can bring the conversation home. Use it when you go to start this conversation. Bring it with you, jot down your ideas, whatever it is. But please use it, because I think it's really going to help you give a framework for all the uncertainty that's out there, that you're absolutely right that you don't have control over. But what you do have control over is your ability to identify what's important to you and your ability to start a conversation. And if you're curious how we can help, you can visit us at apinemd.com. You can sign up for a totally free discovery call and we'll help you think through how we can help. We also have a free blog post, like a free blog section, and we talk a lot about how to communicate about hard things. That's a huge part of what we do. And in there, just in response to someone who posted in that Q&A, we have a blog post that directly addresses, I think it's called How to Talk to Your Parents about Their Health. And we outline, like, I think it's like 8 or 9 steps. So I can send the link to Julie later to share, but I would definitely check that out. And we created that specifically because we get asked that question all the time, like, how do I talk to my parents about their health when they just shut me down? And I think we have a link for the feedback form, which will hopefully show up in the chat. And if there are any, okay, awesome. There's a link for the complimentary workbook. And if there are any caregivers with the group, in this group, we are actually working on an idea to better support caregivers. So if you have 20 to 30 minutes, and if you're willing to chat with us, I would love to really understand your needs. And so if you're interested in that, leave your contact information in, I think it's question 6 of the feedback form.
Dr. Bapat, we really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge with us today. I have shared the link to the feedback form in the chat, if everybody can see that. If there's any follow-up questions or concerns or feedback, please feel free to reach out to me directly or get in touch with Dr. Bapat directly. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
And thank you so much for having me. And I really hope that you noodle on these questions and use these tools going forward. I hope it provides a little bit more of a framework in tackling some of that uncertainty.
Wonderful. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care.
You too. Take care. Bye.